History is a story of choices made in rooms of power, recorded in memos and minutes. But what if the most important choice humanity ever made was never recorded in any history book? What if it was made in a silent, locked hangar under a desert sky by a president who, for a few crucial hours, officially did not exist? On a cold February night in 1954, the President of the United States vanished. Dwight D. Eisenhower, the man who led the Allies through war, disappeared from his Palm Springs vacation. He wasn't in his suite. He wasn't on the golf course. The Associated Press rushed out a bulletin. Eisenhower was dead of a heart attack. Minutes later, the White House scrambled to kill the story with a lie so mundane it had to be true. The president had merely chipped a tooth on a piece of fried chicken and been rushed to a local dentist. The story held for about an hour, until reporters found no record of the dentist, no office, no witnesses. The explanation was a cover. So, where was Eisenhower? According to whispers that have since hardened into legend, he was at Edwards Air Force Base. There, in a locked hangar, he witnessed something that would cleave history into the version we are told and the version we have lived. Just after midnight, lights appeared in the sky. 3 seamless, silver discs settled onto the runway without a sound. A ramp lowered, and figures emerged. They were tall, slender, with pale skin and long, golden hair, their silver suits shimmering as if alive. The men on the ground didn't hear voices. They felt them. Thoughts pressed into their minds with clarity and calm. These beings would later be called the Nordics. They came with an offer, a future free from war and hunger, with technology to cure every disease and energy without cost. Humanity could be guided into a golden age. But they asked for one thing in return: the complete dismantling of every nuclear weapon on Earth. It was an impossible choice. The Cold War was burning hot. Soviet missiles were ready. Could America disarm and trust strangers from the stars? The Nordics also delivered a chilling warning. Another race was already here, predators and parasites who would offer weapons and traps. 2 months later, the warning proved true. Another craft appeared, its metal dull and lightless. Inside, the air was thin and cold. And then came the Greys, small beings with gray skin and enormous, opaque black eyes. Their telepathic words were not warmth, but commands. They knew of the arms race and humanity's fear, and they offered power, particle beam weapons, zero-point energy, and propulsion that bent gravity. With their help, America could leap a century ahead. The price was access, secret underground bases, free passage in our skies, and permission to study our population. They promised the abductions would be painless and limited. Eisenhower faced a choice between 2 futures: a difficult peace with the Nordics or a guaranteed survival with the Greys. In the end, the general in him, the man responsible for millions in a world on the brink, made a soldier's choice. Survival won. The Greada Treaty was sealed, not on paper, but mind to mind. The consequences were immediate. Massive machines began carving a secret geography beneath the deserts of New Mexico and Nevada, with some levels for humans and deeper levels for others. And the abductions began. Lists of the taken were sent to Majestic 12, the secret committee overseeing the pact. But the numbers never added up. For every name on the list, many more were gone. The stories from those few who remembered were of blinding lights and cold, terrifying procedures. Whistleblowers would later claim to have seen entire underground levels filled with tanks containing beings and human parts suspended in fluid. The deal had become a plague. In 1979, engineer Phil Schneider claimed his team accidentally drilled into a deep-level gray nest and a firefight erupted. 66 men died. Schneider survived, scarred and missing fingers. He showed samples of strange metals and told the world that if he were ever found dead by suicide, it would not be by his own hand. Months later, he was found strangled with a catheter tube. The official verdict was suicide. Another voice was William Cooper, a former naval intelligence officer who claimed to have seen the treaty documents. He, too, warned his life was in danger. He, too, was killed. 2 men spoke out. Both were silenced. And Eisenhower? In his 1961 farewell address, he warned of the grave danger posed by the military-industrial complex. To some, it was a political statement. To others, it was a deathbed confession, a coded warning about a deal he wished he could undo. a power he had unleashed but could no longer control. The Nordics had offered light, the Greys offered power. Eisenhower chose power, and our history followed that choice. Since that night, our technology has leapt forward at a pace that defies conventional explanation. Microchips, fiber optics, stealth aircraft. Progress too sudden, too convenient, like gifts from a poison tree. At the same time, the disappearances never stopped. Our skies remain officially quiet, but silence does not mean absence. It means control. So what truly happened in that hangar in 1954? Was humanity given the tools for its own survival, or were we sold at a price we are still paying in the dark? Two futures were offered that night, one of peace and one of power. The choice was made. The only question left is, if you were in his place, staring into the cold, black eyes of extinction, which would you have chosen? By 1955, the whispers were no longer confined to smoke-filled offices. Something had shifted. Engineers talked in careful euphemisms, generals avoided eye contact, and a few reporters began to sense an outline behind the curtain. The claim was simple, impossible, and stubborn. The treaty was real, and history had already changed course. Technology became the first public symptom. In labs across America, prototypes leapt from chalkboard to factory line with breathtaking speed. Glass strands carried light like wires. Tiny lattices of silicon replaced hulking banks of vacuum tubes. Aircraft skin swallowed radar and slipped across the night like a thought. Patents carried human names, and yet the leaps felt less like discovery and more like translation. Someone reading from a book we didn't write. The phrase reverse engineering began to circulate, a neutral term for a radical idea. That box is stamped with years and places like Roswell, once punchlines, were now footnotes in technical manuals whose covers were never meant to leave the building. But this progress had a shadow. Families reported vanishing loved ones the way one reports a storm. Brief, violent, inexplicable. A car idling on a dirt road, door swung wide. Time split into before and after, with no trail a deputy could follow. The official response hardened into a ritual of paperwork and the careful closing of a file. Those who came back described a theater of precision, corridors without seams, light without bulbs, and eyes that reflected everything and revealed nothing. They remembered instruments that hummed but did not cut, until pain arrived without warning and left without scar. Under ultraviolet lamps, faint traces bloomed on skin like unseen constellations. Patients learned to stop talking. Meanwhile, rumors of the underground multiplied. Work crews hired on special contracts returned thinner and quieter, speaking in negatives about a world with no windows and no sun. A shape emerged, elevators plunging past numbered levels to a place whispered in bars and bus stations. Level 7. A place of no return, where tanks glowed with a sick green light, and machinery sounded disturbingly like breath. The word incubation began to appear in the margins of photocopied memos, as if the writers feared it might infect the page. Unverified accounts spoke of rows of cylinders, small gray forms suspended in liquid, and among them, human fragments, cataloged by a logic no human had voted to endorse. The question hardened into a blade. Was this cooperation or exploitation? Whistleblowers stepped into the light and paid the price. Phil Schneider unbuttoned his shirt on cheap stages, pointing to scars that crossed his torso like maps of a war no one had announced. He named tunnels, dates, and the color of sparks when stone meets alien heat. He wrote a sentence that would outlive him. If I'm ever found to have done it to myself, I didn't. Months later, the headline chose the word suicide. Another voice came over the radio, gravel low and strangely calm. William Cooper said he had read the paperwork officials swore did not exist, drawing lines between crashes, committees, and a treaty signed without ink. He predicted his own, and not as arrest, but as elimination. When the sirens finally came, the paperwork again chose a familiar label that satisfied procedure, but not certainty. As testimonies accumulated, so did the pace of invention. Computers shrank until a child could carry the power that once took a building. Stealth became geometry and skin. Metal remembered its shape after violence. Every leap raised the same uneasy prayer. Let there be an earthly origin, a lineage of trial and error we can trace. But the speed felt like a drumbeat we did not set. Then the rumors darkened further. Hybrids. Not alien. Not human. Something that borrowed from both. Midwives recalled infants whose eyes seemed too deep, too knowing. Priests argued softly in sacristies, unsure if they stood at a manger or a threshold. The arguments were not about morality at first. They were about reality. Could this be done? Had it been done? If so, who authorized the experiment that makes the species its own subject? Records disappeared with suspicious competence. Boxes were mislabeled, logs burned, shelves rearranged until the path of evidence became a maze designed to exhaust the will. Witnesses learned the precise distance between telling the truth and ruining a life, and many chose silence not because they were liars, but because they were tired. All the while, a portrait hung in a corridor most will never walk. The man in the frame stared past the painter, towards something he alone could see. Eisenhower's farewell address played in schoolrooms, his warning about the military-industrial complex sounding like civics. But to those who knew the other script, it sounded like a confession, a statesman's way of admitting that sometimes you choose the door marked survival, and discover too late it also reads surrender. So what, exactly, did we inherit? A century's head start, perhaps, but also an arithmetic we still refuse to publish. For every new capability, how many names went into the ledger the public never sees? If the shield grew stronger, who became the test material? The witnesses who remain do not ask you to believe them. They ask you to look at the curve of invention, at the curve of disappearance, and decide whether two lines that close can be unrelated. By the end of the 1950s, the story had bifurcated. Publicly, optimism, rockets, the bright grammar of progress. Privately, basements, redactions, and funerals that felt colder than grief alone can explain. A nation can hold both truths for a time, but time always asks for payment. Perhaps that is the nature of power purchased in secret. The benefits are spectacular and televised. The costs are quiet and distributed. What remains is a question that refuses to age. In 1954, did we save ourselves from a foreign empire, or did we lease our future to an empire without a flag? We inherit that negotiation. We decide whether to keep the file closed or to turn the page. And if we turn it, we must be ready for the simplest, hardest conclusion of all, that the story of our age is not only the story of what we built, but of what we were willing to trade to build it. The new decade arrived dressed in confidence, neon and chrome, picture tubes and promises. The country learned to look up and expect greatness. Yet beneath the bright grammar of progress, the shadow of a private history lengthened. The treaty, if treaty it was, did not end a story. It began one, and the 1960s carried it forward with a smile that never quite reached the eyes. In control rooms, telemetry marched across green screens like scripture. The nation rehearsed what a triumph should sound like. But in the margins of mission transcripts, oddities appeared. Objects pacing capsules, lights that kept formation where weather could not. Astronauts smiled for cameras and told the safest version of events. But offstage, they traded glances that said more than press briefings ever could. As the public dreamed of footprints in lunar dust, the ground at home opened. Experiments migrated underground into facilities where corridors had no seams and walls hummed faintly. There, according to whispers, the boundary between study and manufacture blurred. The word hybrid moved from rumor to file folder. Midwives told stories they did not write down. Priests argued theologies with the volume turned low. Babies arrived whose eyes tracked with unsettling steadiness. Children who learned to read too quickly. Some called it a miracle of nature. Others used harder words. Evidence, when it mattered most, vanished. Boxes were mislabeled. Ash settled in basements where incinerators ran too long. A few pages slipped past the net, and on those fragments, one phrase survived the black bars. Greada Agreement, 1954. The line sat there like a tooth in a jaw. Mute, undeniable, attached to a hidden structure. The country learned a new verb spoken softly in secure halls, reverse engineer. It sounded practical, but beneath the civics, an admission hovered. Something had been found. The story turned darker where sunlight could not reach. In the deep levels, people said, rows of tanks breathed with a careful rhythm. Small gray forms floated like ideas not yet born. And among them, the detail that changed voices, parts that were not gray. Pants. Ice. The notion that a species could become a resource, that the boundary around a human body was merely a suggestion, forced language to fail. Every decade invents its dissidents. One man lifted his shirt on bright stages and traced a map of injuries across his torso, naming tunnels and dates like a catechism. Another spoke into a microphone in a room too small for his claims. They warned in plain English and predicted consequences that sounded melodramatic until they came true. The men kept talking. Then they stopped. Above it all, the Cold War kept time. The space race offering a public theater where fear could dress as wonder. A flag on a gray horizon, a cheer shared across the planet. The victory was real, yet suspicion grew that our sprint through technology had a tailwind we were not allowed to name. Microchips replaced rooms. Stealth turned night into invisibility. Metal remembered its shape after trauma. If this was a miracle, it was an oddly bureaucratic one, patented, budgeted, redacted. Communities far from capitals felt the story in smaller ways. A mother taped a flyer to a lamppost and found 3 others already there. A farmer woke in a field with soil in his mouth and a date he could not account for. A deputy learned the choreography of a missing persons report so well he could perform it with the lights off. The nation split. Those who laughed because it cost less, and those who could not because something in their house would not let them. By the 1970s, silence itself had become a policy. Declassified pages arrived with most of the pieces blacked out. Academics dismissed patterns as coincidence. Believers saw coincidence as the laziest explanation. Town halls filled and officials held to the line that endurance requires secrecy. People asked, secrecy from whom? Enemies, or from us? What haunted the era was not one fact, but a ratio. For every new capability, how many names entered the ledger no one could find? If the treaty purchased survival, what exactly did it spend? The work continued. Elevators descended. Gates locked. Culture metabolized the pressure by turning it into entertainment, magazines, television, jokes. To laugh was safer. To believe was lonely. To know was to accept a life that would never again fit inside polite conversation. Still, patterns sharpened. Maps of disappearances traced arcs that matched flight corridors to bases no map admitted. Testimony from men with nothing left to gain echoed across years. Details too granular to coordinate and too consistent to ignore. The same eyes, the same light, the same home. One could call it mass imagination, or notice that the imagination of a nation had somehow agreed on the very same room. The question was no longer whether a president had chosen survival over trust, but whether the choice kept renewing itself without public consent. The country had learned to live with both. The televised comfort of triumph and the untelevised cost of its underside. We adapted, as humans do, to the impossible. We learned to hold 2 truths without letting them touch. That our species had never moved faster, and that we did not entirely know whose legs we were running on. The voiceover does not offer a verdict. It offers a frame. In its stand a row of tanks in a room no one will admit exists, a photograph of men smiling beneath flags, a rocket lifting through cloud, a mother at a lamppost, an old man with a microphone saying he is afraid. Between them runs a thread that begins in a hangar and emerges years later as the world we now call ordinary. If you listen closely, you can hear what the decade practiced. Look up with pride, look down with caution, and if you must look under, do it quickly, quietly, and alone. By the 1980s, secrecy had stopped being a practice and become an institution. Fences grew taller, basements grew deeper, and the vocabulary of denial refined itself into policy. Budgets acquired compartments so narrow only a handful of people could stand inside them. Money traveled through line items that sounded like road maintenance and arrived at doors without names. Above ground, a school canceled its music program. Below ground, a new corridor opened with locks that learned your pulse. A hidden city grew, beautiful in a way that felt wrong. Platforms gliding without wheels, glass holding back oceans of stone, lighting that remembered your footsteps. The partnership had rules, but only for one side. Tools arrived that outperformed their descriptions. Materials bent without creasing. The grays, those small, implacable presences, shared process without teaching principle. Like tutors who refused to explain, they gave answers and kept the method. Human scientists, raised to argue, learned to follow. The arrangement looked like cooperation. It felt like instruction. In the rumors, the most difficult rooms were labeled with a soft word, nursery. Tanks pulsed in rows, lit the color of old bruises. Inside lived silhouettes that respected our categories less than we did. Eyes too still, breathing too quiet, a kind of attention that watched without curiosity. Schedules hung on clipboards with headings no hospital uses, integration window, cognitive parity. Paper is paper, even when it measures what language is not built to hold. Above ground, the Cold War kept the cameras busy. Broadcasters found comfort in the familiar geometry of us and them. A simpler enemy always does. But the enemy on the posters offered cover for a bargain struck in rooms without posters. Citizens feared missiles launched from across the ocean. Few understood the negotiation happening beneath their feet. Whistleblowers surfaced, as they always do. Men with hands that shook not from cowardice, but memory. They lifted shirts to show scars like road maps, and described firefights in darkness, where bullets met beams and lost. The response was professional and practiced. Ridicule, then silence, then removal by paperwork. A few testimonies made their way onto VHS tapes that migrated from living room to living room. A country founded on pamphlets remembered how to pass a message by hand. The 1990s arrived with a grin. Prosperity spilled across magazine covers. The cover-up adjusted its posture. Where denial had once been enough, now came the performance of openness. Press conferences filled with words that clarified nothing, declassifications that exposed fragments arranged to mislead. Pilots filed reports and learned to retract them. Air traffic controllers logged impossible blips and watched the logs be collected by people whose names did not appear on the staffing chart. Disappearance, meanwhile, remained stubbornly analog. A refrigerator took on the weight of 5 missing posters, then 6. A mother learned to light a candle without letting her hands shake. In town halls, citizens asked whether protection can be called protection when it forbids explanation. The word unusual did a great deal of work. Culture metabolized the pressure with theater and therapy. Tabloids screamed, talk shows chuckled, comedians filed the terror down to a headline-sized joke. Then, every so often, the laughter thinned. A radar tape leaked. A pilot spoke on the record. A home video from a lonely highway refused to be anything but what it was. Skeptics were right to demand rigor. Believers were right to notice that the same shapes kept arriving, from mouths that had never met. What changed everything was not proof, but access. The digital age took what had been a rumor economy and turned it into an archive. Forums stitched together dots that official histories kept separate. Maps of crash sites and air corridors began to look like constellations, and once you see a constellation you have to work to unsee it. Governments answered with takedowns and firewalls, but every removed post produced 10 summaries. Silence adapted. It learned to delay. We're looking into it. Tomorrow became a place where truth could safely live because tomorrow is always farther away than a heart can afford. Meanwhile, below ground, the schedule held. By the late 1990s, 2 narratives had settled beside each other like neighbors who refused to speak. The official story was tidy: progress, security, stewardship. The other story was untidy on purpose. Too many names, too many nights, too much grief to fold into a statement. A country had learned to look at the same sky and see different things. A soldier watched a radar echo move where physics said it should not and chose not to write it down. Inside the vaults, a stamped folder slid into a drawer slid into a wall hummed and forgot the drawer existed. A nation accustomed to confirmation learned the habit of inference. It learned to feel the shape of what is missing. And then, as the century turned, the surface and the underworld touched. Cameras and phones made witnesses of anyone with a battery. A light crossed a cul-de-sac without noise or hurry. The footage looked the way truth often looks when it arrives uninvited: shaky, grainy, undeniable. For a night, silence lost the lead. It would take it back by morning, but something essential had shifted. Once a rumor has a face, it is no longer the same. The reaction revealed the age. Experts filled airtime with vocabulary whose purpose was not to explain, but to calm. Yet the next evening, more people stood on more rooftops, staring at a sky that felt closer. They knew only that they preferred confusion to the old kind of certainty. Which brings us to the quietest detail, normalization. The country functioned while carrying a hole in its story large enough to fall through. The institution of secrecy had learned to outlast outrage. It discovered that fatigue can do what force cannot. And yet, fatigue is not surrender. A candlelit vigil in a small town does not change a policy, it changes a person. Enough persons, and policy begins to hear a new music. By the end, the question had not changed, only its audience. Once it belonged to a handful of men in a hangar. Now it belonged to a species preparing to choose again. Are we safer than we were? Are we who we were? The vaults offered no answers, only locks. Between them stood the country, learning at last that the hardest part of a secret is not keeping it, it is living inside it. At the turn of the century, the whispers refused to fade. They changed stations, changed usernames, changed masks, but they did not die. In 1,000 late-night rooms, callers spoke of lights, missing hours, and memories stitched with fear. They were ordinary voices, truckers on long highways, nurses off the night shift, soldiers between deployments, each repeating a pattern they could not have coordinated. Therapists kept drawers of sketches, ovals with eyes, corridors without seams, that came from different hands in different towns, dated years apart, and yet they rhymed. In laboratories, the future arrived in parts. Fibers carrying oceans of data, chips the size of a fingernail, aircraft that swallowed radar. Officially, this was innovation. Unofficially, it looked like inheritance, a steady translation of knowledge from an origin the public wasn't permitted to pronounce. Meanwhile, grief learned to travel. Vigils lit small town squares with posters, candles, and silence. A child held a grandmother's hand and learned the ceremony of waiting. The wound did not heal. It adapted, the way skin adapts around a foreign object left beneath it. Within vaults, the bargain hardened into procedure. Paperwork made the outrageous ordinary. Checklists for integration windows, charts for sensor concordance, memos where renewal appeared without an end date. The partnership taught vocabulary to engineers and discipline to consciences. Control was not theatrical, it was tidy. Budgets became myths with line items. Money is not evil, but it is obedient. It goes where it is told, especially when it is told to disappear. Below ground, boundaries softened. The rooms some labeled nursery were bright, clean, and wrong. Incubation arrays pulsed with a devotional regularity, and checklists replaced lullabies. The faces inside the glass looked back with an attention that unnerved even the practiced. Hybrids, once rumor, matured into schedules and milestones. Above ground, denial adjusted its wardrobe. Ridicule still made the rounds, but it no longer covered the bill. The strategy shifted from "there is nothing" to "we're looking into it," from erasure to delay. Tomorrow became a safe house for truth, close enough to echo, far enough to miss. Spokespeople promised clarity. Clarity developed a habit of arriving late and unrecognizable. Then the internet multiplied eyesight. Forums stitched fragments into maps. Amateurs did what armies of editors would not. Constellations formed across the screen, crash sites, air corridors, bases that official diagrams forgot, and once seen, they refused to unsee. Firewalls rose, takedowns fell, but mirrors hosted copies upon copies. Every deletion proved the point it hoped to avoid, that something real squirmed beneath the language. And then came the nights when the sky forgot to cooperate. A cul-de-sac looked up and found exactly what the late-night callers had been describing. A craft that moved wrong and felt right. A light that did not blink. A silence that redefined the word. Phones came up, hands shook, but the frames held. A glide without wings. A turn without radius. A presence without pretense. For a breathless span of hours, the cover-up faltered, not because a door opened, but because 100 million windows did. Governments sprinted to name the unnameable with phrases like atmospheric phenomena and sensor anomalies, words that drafted calm while declining responsibility. But the laughter that once protected the public nervous system failed. The jokes landed with a thud. Mockery now sounded like denial dressed for television. Streets filled, first with curiosity, then with intent. Candles gathered into rivers of light. Banners insisted on verbs: disclose, account, answer. The world argued itself hoarse, and in arguing, learned how large the question had become. What began as a rumor about a president in 1954 now stood as a referendum on who got to define reality. Inside agencies, the reflex held. Classified stamps fell like hammers. Yet outside, the silence thinned. Witnesses who had aged into caution found new courage in a million small screens. Younger voices, allergic to gatekeepers, painted the story with tools that could not be recalled once shared. Meanwhile, the sky continued its patient routine: appear, retreat, repeat. An observation without introduction. It felt less like a courtship than a test, as if the proctors had decided to measure not our technology, but our character. Could a nation look into its own reflection, shimmering, unfamiliar, and choose reform over panic? By then, the bargain's fingerprints were everywhere, in pockets that pulsed with borrowed genius, in jets that vanished from screens, in the posture of a mother at a vigil who had forgotten how to cry and learned how to organize instead. We were not who we had been. We were something else, faster, sharper, more connected, more surveilled, and far more practiced at living with contradictions. Which leaves a final inventory. On one side, progress you can hold, medicine that borders on miracle, a civilization that speaks to itself. On the other, rooms without windows, budgets without voters, names on flyers that turn neighborhoods into chapels. Between them, a choice that keeps renewing itself without asking permission. Survival or surrender. Security or sovereignty. The film does not pretend to answer. It offers a witness. It shows the vault doors and the living rooms, the trams below and the vigils above, the document that says renewal, and the child who asks why the stars sometimes move like fish. It sets the portrait of a president beside the mirror where a face, just for a breath, seems to become something more than human, or less, or simply new. And it asks the only question that still matters, when the silence finally breaks, not in a night of lights, but in a day of signatures. What will we have become in the waiting? Perhaps that is the lesson of the long hush, that secrecy can bend a nation, but it cannot finish the sentence. People do that. We do. We decide whether to end the paragraph with a period, or to cut a new path with a question mark. Doors fail when enough hands find the same handle. Candles become sunrise when there are enough of them. And a bargain made in a language without paper is still a bargain we can answer, one steady, deliberate truth at a time.